So we lift up these prayers in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Good morning. A good day today? Yeah, it's a good day. And a great day to be seen and to see you. Thanks for coming. It's good to be together and be a church. Love being together, worshiping God on Sunday mornings. And if this is the first time you've done that with us, well, my name is Brian. I'd love to meet you. And we're thankful you're here. Come back anytime. Doors are open to the building. Doors are open to friendship. And we just want you to know you're cared for and want you to feel included and not sort of on the periphery. So thank you for being here if it's your first time with us. Hey, last week I mentioned that daredevil thrill seeker Travis Pastrana was going to jump his motorcycle over the fountain at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas in an attempt to duplicate what Evel Knievel did 50 years earlier, except just not crash land. Did anybody watch that last week? Yeah, he did it pretty well, didn't he? As a matter of fact, 3 jumps he duplicated of Evel Knievel. What a thrill seeker, what a risk taker, right? And we're talking about risks in these days. We just started last week. What do we know about risks? If you were here last week, what do you know about risks? We all take them, right? We all take risks. The only difference between us is the degree of risk that we're willing to take. That's the difference between us. Maybe you're a risk taker who'd do something like this. Take a look. How many of you would do this? Raise your hand. Come on, chicken. Okay, wait for it. It gets good. Pamplona, Spain, running the bulls, as you know. Oh, how about that? Wait for it. Oh, yeah, that feels good. This too. Oh, oh! Look at the tennis shoe. Oh, maybe that represents some of the risks. But maybe you're more like this. Perhaps this is your idea of a risk.
The running of the bull dogs? Surprising. What's not surprising? How much money Aaliyah saved by switching to Geico.
Now, how many of you are more like the second video, yeah? Yeah, I'll do that. Give me a bulldog to lick my face and jump all over me. Listen, while God isn't calling any of us to run with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain, or as we mentioned last week, to jump out of a plane or tightrope between skyscrapers in New York City or swim with sharks, what God does ask of us oftentimes feels even less inviting. From the human side, God's instructions, they can seem risky, but ultimately what we learn is that the safest and most productive way to journey through life on this earth is by trusting God enough to do whatever He asks, regardless of the difficulty. And in our summer series called Standing Strong, we're looking at individuals who have responded in such a way. God asks them to do something difficult. They step into it. They lean all of who they are into the goodness and the sovereignty of God, and they trust Him. There are many examples of men in the Old Testament, women in the Old Testament, men in the New, and women in the New. And in this series, 9 weeks, we'll look at 9 different individuals. Last week, we looked at Abraham. This morning, we're going to peer into the life of a teenager. This teenager happens to be the great-grandson of Abraham. His name is Joseph. And what Joseph chose to do repeatedly will surprise us. But more than surprise, what I'm hoping is that it would inspire us, encourage us, motivate us, and challenge us to live just the way that he did. A comedian once said, if broken hearts were commercials, we'd all be on TV. It's true. If you have a pulse, if you're alive and you're breathing, then somebody somewhere, sometime has hurt you. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been rejected by a loved one, if you've ever been injured by the very ones who should have been protecting you, then Joseph wants to show you something by his life this morning. If you've ever been falsely accused, if someone has ever damaged your reputation, if you've ever been made to pay the price for somebody else's sin, well, then Joseph wants to show you something by his life this morning. If people have failed to deliver on their promises to you, if you've ever questioned where God is when you're in pain, if you've ever wondered what happened to the life you once had or that you dreamed of having, well, then I know this teenager who has something to say. Were Joseph to walk through the doors and into this room this morning, and if in one sentence he was going to summarize his life, I imagine him saying something like this. People do hurtful things, but God is up to something good. Let's say that together. People do hurtful things, but God is up to something good. Let's pray. Father, what we've just said together is true. People do hurtful things. And that truth doesn't go away, but it is subject to the greater truth, and that is that you are up to something good. Show us through Joseph's life what you would have each one of us understand about both of those truths. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, where does Joseph land in human history? Just to contextualize it here a little bit. We live as many years after the life of Jesus Christ as Joseph lived before it. We go backwards about 2,000 to Jesus. You go backwards 1,900 to Joseph from Jesus. So about 4,000 years ago from where we stand today. God had made a promise, if you heard last week, he had made a promise to bless Abraham and through Abraham to create a whole new people group that we would know as the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites. And that God would then, through Abraham and his descendants that were too numerous to count, he would then show the entire world, everyone who lived, regardless of people group, nation, nationality, etc., that he was a God that created the world and he loved them as well. And so the Jews were supposed to be a conduit, and in so many wonderful ways they have been, a conduit of God's truth and grace to the rest of the world. Well, it began with Abraham. To Abraham was born Isaac. God would not allow Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. To Isaac was born Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Then he had 12 kids. One of those kids, Joseph. If you're going to chronicle Joseph's life, you could describe it in 3 seasons. So we'll look at the 3 seasons of his life. Season 1, you could call family strife. Because this is a story, there's lots of verses to read, because we're going to read the significant portions of the story. And you'll see that on the screen in most cases. So let's dive in. The life of Joseph, Genesis has 50 chapters. The life of Joseph spans all but one chapter between chapter 37 and 50. There's a lot of print, a lot of ink given to this teenager's life. So let's read. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. Canaan, Israel, right? We know where that is. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was, how old? Teenager. He often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of the other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe, the Technicolor, right, Dreamcoat. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more. I mean, who likes favoritism when you're not the favored? Because he loved them more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. Verse 5, one night Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. All right, so a couple things. Joseph's one of 12 brothers, right? They live a few miles south of present-day Jerusalem in Hebron, in Canaan, or the land of Israel. We see him at age 17. He's one of the ones that, of course, all the sons do, tend his father's flock. To say that he had a bad relationship with his brothers is certainly an understatement. What we see happening in these verses is a recipe for resentment. He's the favored child. He's the favored one. He's known to bring back bad reports about what his brothers are doing out there tending the flock. And he's given gifts the others don't get, right? This tunic or robe. I mean, you might as well have had a sign on the back of his robe that says, "Kick me," right? "Hate me, I'm daddy's favorite," because that's what that robe translated in terms of emotions to the 11 brothers. To make matters worse, he had a couple of dreams, and he took the liberty of sharing his dreams with his brothers. Not a very good idea. But understand, he didn't ask for the dreams. God gave them to him. And what teenager at 17 isn't going to share something that's sort of exceptional, right? Or astounding, even if it may put him in a bad light. And so he shares the dreams. The first dream is there's 12 stalks of wheat, right? And 11 of the stalks bow down to one of the stalks. Well, he's the one that's standing there being bowed to. And so he tells his brothers that one of these days you're all going to bow to me. Oh, that really put him in their graces, right? The other one, it included his parents, and that is sun, moon, and stars. I don't know how they bow, but that was the dream. They're sort of subservient to Joseph. And so he tells them about that as well. So both dreams indicate the same thing. He's going to be honored, and they'll be doing the honoring, the very ones who hate him. Well, routinely, the 11 brothers are sent to care for their father's flock in Shechem. Sometimes Joseph's held back because he's younger, and he's also the favored one, right? Don't get your fingernails dirty. You stay here with Pops. We'll have a good time. ESPN, little tennis, whatever. We'll work on the cars or the camels. You and me, stay here. Well, what we find next is, and you won't see this on the screen, but Jacob says to Joseph, "Hey, listen, I want you to go to Shechem," it was about 50 miles away, "and go check on your brothers and then bring me back a report." See, his father kind of set him up for some of this antagonism. You go check on them and bring back to me a report. So in the next scene, the brothers see Joseph coming. And I imagine them thinking, this is going to be a good day. We're 50 miles from home. Dad can't say a thing that we do say. Nothing with respect to Joseph. Let me read something. You won't see this on the screen. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him at a distance. As he approached, they made plans not to play a trick on him, to kill him. You see, they had been at the boiling point. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns." A big hole in the ground, right? A dried out one. "We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." I mean, the dreams really pushed him over the edge, the interpretation of it, that is. Well, Reuben is the oldest brother, and the oldest brother always has responsibility to his father for the rest of the brothers, including Joseph. If it were not for Reuben who intervened, they would have killed him that day. But that's not what happened. Again, not on the screen. It says, "But when Reuben heard of their scheme to kill the brother, he came to Joseph's rescue. 'Let's not kill him,' he said. 'Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into that empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him.'" Now, secretly, we're told, Reuben was planning to later return to that cistern and rescue Joseph, trying to appease his brothers, keep a catastrophe from happening. Well, instead of murder, what ends up happening, if you know the story, is they settle for a mugging. They grab him, they rip his clothes off him, Somebody else is now wearing the coat of many colors, or they've torn it and thrown it aside. Actually, later they bring it to their father and had blood put on it to prove to the father that he had died, but it was blood of an animal. So they jump him, right? They tear off his clothes, they throw him in that dried out cistern. Incredibly, at this point, the Bible says that the brothers actually sit down next to the cistern and have lunch while their brother's way down in there. Imagine being Joseph, hearing the commentary about him by his brothers, the hatred, right? The spite, the antagonism. That would hurt. How broken he must have felt. Well, before they finish eating lunch, it just so happens that a caravan of Ishmaelites, by the way, that goes back to who? Ishmael. And there's always good feeling between these, right? They're passing by, and what happens, right? They decide to sell Joseph to these Ishmaelite slave traders who are going where? Headed south. And if you're in Israel, you go south, you're going to come upon Egypt. So, can you imagine this? Now they're hoisting their, hey, we got something for you. And they're hoisting their brother up on a rope. They dust him off. They tell him to stand straight, daddy's boy, look your best. And now they're haggling over his life. What's his life worth? For how many pieces of silver was Jesus betrayed by Judas in the New Testament? 30. Joseph, not so much. 20 shekels. What the comparison is, I'm not so sure, but I think it's less. 20 shekels. That's what they sold him for. The favored son is now a foreign slave. He's hand-tied and probably had to walk the 200 miles down to Egypt. What a change of life. So to the pain of rejection and hatred is added the anguish of desertion. All the way through this story, as we read it, you have to stop and ask questions. What would it feel like? Have you ever experienced pain in your family relationships? Let's just look at that subject, right? If I asked you who hasn't had family pain, there'd be no hands raised. We all have, to some degree or another. But pain within the confines of family, it goes deep, because that's the one context in which we think it shouldn't really happen. We're family, we're blood, we got to get along, we got to love each other, have each other's backs. And yet all of us have experienced some measure, some just horrendous measure of pain within the confines of family. You can relate to this teenager, Joseph. He was sold by his family. Joseph understands how you feel, but do you know what he would say to you? He'd say, people do hurtful things, but God is up to something good. He would say that to you today if you walked through those doors. People do, you're right, sometimes their family, really profoundly hurtful things to us, but God is up to something good. All right, that's season 1, family strife. Season 2, the suffering servant. Now he's in Egypt. Remember, he's a slave to be sold. So you go to the market square there in Egypt, Cairo, and he's put up on the trading blocks. Somebody buys him. The guy that buys him actually happens to be a very wealthy politician within Egyptian government, and his name is Potiphar. How would you like to be sold? First you were sold, then you're purchased. You're sold a second time. How would that feel? And you have to wonder, did God take a coffee break? Was he paying attention to somebody else and forgot about Joseph? How could he let this happen? It says in verse 1 of chapter 39, when Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, so what happened? He succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of the Egyptian master, his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. Everything got better for Potiphar with this new slave. So give him more, get him more involved, right? Maybe more things will go well, and that's exactly what happened. Second half of verse 4. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. Pretty good gig if you got to be a slave. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless who? Who? Potiphar. What? Because of Joseph. All his household affairs, they ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So what does Potiphar do? I like this Joe guy. He's great. Where you been, Joe? So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what he's going to eat. Not a bad life for Potiphar. So we read back in verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. Joseph had nothing when he arrived in Egypt, and he was nothing when he arrived in Egypt. He's still a slave, but now he's, if you want to say it, living in great comfort. In great comfort. He's not living as the son of a shepherd or a farmer and all the rest. He's now living in a pretty decent environment. But then an odd thing happens as the weeks go by. It says in verse 6 of chapter 39, Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar, he just so happened to have a wife, who soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. Now think about, put yourself in Joseph's place, right? Here's a guy who's lost his family. He doesn't have any thoughts of perhaps being able to see them. Maybe he dreams of seeing them again, even the brothers who hate him. He's lost his dad. He's lost everything that he's used to. His home, his language, his country, his freedom. Everything that's comfortable, knowable, understood. Lost it all. And now this woman comes to you and says, hey, have sex with me. In the weariness of his condition, don't you think it would be a logical, on a human level, conclusion to say, well, you know what, I've lost everything. And God didn't stop me from losing everything. Maybe it's time for me to pay attention to Joe here, Maybe I could use a little bit of a break, a little satisfaction, so to speak, not to be crude. But imagine the power of that temptation given the vulnerabilities of his station in life. Humanly speaking, he's coming from a place of weakness. So what does he do? Let me say this. Nothing dictates our behavior more than the conclusions we draw about God. Did you hear that? Nothing dictates, nothing drives, nothing influences your decisions in life more than the conclusions you draw about the character of God. Let's read what happens. But Joseph refused, verse 8. Look, he told her, my master, who's your husband, lady, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except for you, ma'am, because you're his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Two things motivate him to say no. His respect for his master and his love for God. His view of God. And what's his perspective? People do hurtful things, but God is always up to something good. And so he leans on the good character of God, and that dictates his refusal to satisfy himself through something that would be horrible. Verse 10. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her. And he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Well, now you've got a rejected, angry, humiliated wife. She cries rape, lies to her husband, has the cloak to prove that Joseph tried to initiate, right? He sexually, abused me. Well, you know what happens, right? He's in prison. Potiphar puts him there. I gave you everything. Look what you did to my wife. He doesn't just throw him into sort of the county jail. This is a special prison. This is a special prison, one reserved for prisoners of Pharaoh. So you can imagine it's probably at a level, at a depth of degradation and just grossness and filth and discomfort far beneath any other prison you could be sent to, and that's where he's thrown. I can imagine him there thinking, I just did everything God wanted me to do. What good does it do to obey God? But Joseph is faithful to God, and what happens? It lands him in prison. People do hurtful things, but God is always up to something good. God did the same thing for Joseph in prison as he did for Joseph when he was sold to Potiphar. Remember? He sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar gets him to the place because of the favor of God, gets Joseph to the place where now he's in charge of everything. Yes, he's still, in terms of his social standing, he's a slave. But he's in the best possible situation you could possibly imagine for a slave. Most free people didn't live as well as Joseph did in Potiphar's house, all because of the favor of God, all because even in the midst of difficulty and pain and the sin leveled against us, God is up to something good. And so, in prison, God does something good in Joseph's life. He has success and favor. It's not long before Joseph is given command over the other prisoners. You won't see this on the screen, but it says, sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker, two other individuals, they offended their royal master, Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in prison. And who happened to be in prison? Joseph as well. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So Joseph has got favor. Yes, he's still in prison. It's a horrible place. He has no freedom. It's filthy, I'm sure. But now he's got some sort of reason for being there, if you will, and that is to care for the other prisoners. Now two more prisoners show up, a cupbearer to Pharaoh and the baker, the personal baker for Pharaoh as well. Somehow they offended Pharaoh. They're in prison also. They have dreams. Now, dreams were a big deal in the Old Testament. People believed that it was through dreams that the gods, in some cases, right, those that didn't believe in the God, were trying to communicate something, right? But even those who followed Yahweh, God, and he did often communicate through dreams. And so both of these individuals, the cupbearer and the baker, have dreams in prison. They don't know the meaning. And you got to know the meaning. What does it all mean, right? Joseph's there to care for them, and Joseph says, well, I can tell you. I can tell you. So they share their dreams, and Joseph interprets both of them. For the cupbearer, the dream was that he would be restored to his old job with Pharaoh. You're going to get out of here. You're going to get your job back in 3 days. You want to be the cupbearer, believe me. Because the interpretation of the baker's dream was, you got 3 days before you're out of here, but that's because you're going to die. And in 3 days, both things happened. One is back into Pharaoh's palace. The other is dead. It says in chapter 40, and this is what Joseph says to the cupbearer on the way out the door. He says, please remember me, do me a favor. And here you see just the raw humanness of Joseph, right? He wasn't some supernatural, right, given a better chance of doing things right than anybody else. He simply chose to believe the right things about God. But you can see his humanity. Nothing wrong in asking a favor. But can you see it? He's tired of living in that prison. What does he say? And please remember and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so that he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my household. Is that true? That's true. The land of the Hebrews. And now I'm here in prison, and I did nothing to deserve it. Is that true? Yeah, you look at his life. He didn't do anything to deserve where he is. So you see that just this passion to have his life circumstance changed. Well, you would think that's great, right? Because now God's always up to something good. He did a favor for the cupbearer. The cupbearer's got to be really happy. He's going to Pharaoh. Why not put in a good word for Joseph to get him out of the prison? That must be God's plan. Well, not so fast. It's not. It says that the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. You know, I'm out. Wouldn't want to be you. Forgets about him. The result of his forgetfulness wasn't any small thing. I mean, we don't know how long Joseph's been in prison already, but we know from that point forward it was 2 more years. How would you like to be Joseph? While other teenagers are back home in Israel playing baseball at Hebron High, getting ready for the prom, or thinking about summer jobs and family vacations on the Mediterranean, if you will, Joseph was snatched away from everything common and comfortable. He lost everything associated with his identity, his family, his home, again, his country, his language, his freedom. He spends 11 years, starting from the age of 17, serving Potiphar, the thanks for which he got 2 years of confinement in Pharaoh's prison. Joseph now in prison is 30 years old. 13 years as a slave in a foreign country. One can't read his story and not be struck by the reality that God allows us to suffer. He does. And sometimes for a lengthy period of time. But God had not forgotten to be gracious. Listen to what happens. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed. Now, who's having a dream? Pharaoh's having a dream. He was standing on the bank of the Nile River in his dream, and in his dream he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up from behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows, right, on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows, pretty hungry I'm sure, ate the 7 healthy fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh wakes up. What the heck does that mean? I had a bunch of cows in my dream. The skinny ones ate the fat ones. I have no idea what that means. Falls back asleep and had a second dream same night. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on the single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh wakes up again and realized it was a dream. But what he didn't realize was what it all meant, either the cows or the heads of grain. So he's disturbed by it, again, because in this culture, in the ancient world, people always gave great importance to having a dream and discovering its meaning. So he's disturbed. He calls for all of his magicians and wise men. He tells them the dream, but nobody can figure it out. Then what happens? Well, the cupbearer is realizing what's going on. He knows that his boss is upset about a dream. He says, oh, I know a guy. It's like you got a mechanic, right? I know a guy. He's actually in your prison, Pharaoh. He told me my dream. It came true. So you know how the story goes. If you don't, I'll tell you. Joseph's taken out of prison. He comes to Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams for Pharaoh. And he gives credit to God. He says, tell me the dream, and now I'm going to tell you. But I'm not telling you. God through me is going to tell you. Now he's 30. He just keeps on maturing, gives credit to God. He essentially tells him this: I'm going to give you the crop forecast for Egypt for the next 14 years. Do we understand how valuable that information would be? This is like inside trading, right? You know the future before it happens, and then you're going to adjust your investments because you know what's going to happen. In agricultural society, nothing is more significant than knowing the weather ahead of time. And what Joseph says to him is, for 7 years, we're going to have bumper crop after bumper crop after bumper crop. We're going to be more grain than we're going to get sick of grain. But beginning the 8th year, for 7 more, there'll be a famine. Well, he thinks that Joseph's got some sort of wisdom, and so he believes him. And he says, you'll be in charge of my court, and all my people, everyone, will take orders from you. He says, can you find anyone else like this man who's so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? No, you couldn't. So he says this, Pharaoh. He says, I'm Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. This is incredible. He's elevated from a slave to the second most powerful individual in all the land of Egypt. The only one who has more power is Pharaoh. He gives him his signet ring, takes it right off his finger and hands it to Joseph. That's the ring of authority, right? You seal documents with it. He was given a gold chain around his neck. He was given chariots, given authority and power. This is sort of comical. He's given a new robe. Season 3, the ready ruler, because now he's no longer a slave. The advanced crop report, given by Joseph, it comes true. For 7 years, what does Joseph do in wisdom? He has built these silos, these granaries, where they store up grain for 7 years in preparation for the 7 years of famine to follow. And these granaries were built all throughout Egypt under Joseph's instruction. But I want you to know something interesting here. Since the day his brothers mugged him in the fields and sold him to the slave traders, Joseph had been a slave. Now he's 30. But now he's 30 and he's free. But now he's 30, he's free, and he has power. He has authority. What might you think about doing? Okay, forget you. What might I think about doing? I got my chariot, I got my power. Wherever I go, it's required of the public to bow down to me. Well, I might just go have a little chat with a cupbearer. Don't you think? I lost 2 years of life because of him. I might hop on my chariot and go pay a visit to Potiphar. Oh, not Potiphar, but to Potiphar's house and have a conversation with the missus. Even more to the point, I may say to Pharaoh, hey, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm going north. It'll take me a week to get there. Where I'm going is Canaan. Haven't seen my father and my brothers for a long time. I'll be back. And I'd go to Canaan perhaps with some Egyptian soldiers and just, hey, brothers, how you doing? See, that's human nature, right? Power, authority, and freedom. Combined with almost 2 full decades of pain. But he doesn't do that. But God gives him a couple kids. Through Pharaoh, he'd gotten married and gave him 2 sons. One by the name of Manasseh, the other by the name of Ephraim. Manasseh means, God has made me forget my troubles. Ephraim means, God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief. Where had God made Joseph fruitful? In the land of his grief. Not in the moments of joy. It's at the point of pain. Prolonged, deep, extended pain. It's in that context that God then makes him fruitful. We can't miss that. And so he names his 2 children after what he sees God doing. Well, the story continues. Everybody, I'm not going to read it, everybody, not just Egypt, but the surrounding nations, they come to Egypt for grain. And Jacob, right, Joseph's father, and he hasn't seen him. They're in the north, and Jacob says to the other 11 brothers, get down. Actually, he sent 10 of them. Get down to Egypt and get us some grain. And it's this famine that God uses to reunite younger brother with his family. 22 years have gone by. Joseph sees his brothers. They don't recognize him because he looks Egyptian. The way he's dressed, his power, he's in the palace. But he sees them and he recognizes them and he's talking to them. And he's just about ready to burst with emotion. He sends all the Egyptians out of the room and he breaks down and he sobs. And it says in the passage that he cried so loud that the Egyptian attendants that were outside of the room could hear the sobs of Joseph. Imagine the pain and the emotion that built up for 22 years, all the while doing things God's way. He says, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? Then he says, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You see what's going on. You can see here his life principle. People do hurtful things, but God's always up to something good. And he says, this is what God did. Don't blame yourself. Yeah, you injured me. But this was all under God's orchestration. God was up to something good. So he says, go back to my father and tell him that Joseph, tell him I'm here. And tell him to get everybody down here. Otherwise, you're going to die. There were still 5 years of famine left at this point. So Joseph sends these Egyptian U-Hauls, a whole caravan of them, up to Canaan, collect the 70 people that had become part of the larger family clan, all of their belongings, everything, the tent spikes, the tents, everything, the rugs, the animals, in the U-Hauls, whoop, down to Egypt, where they can be spared. Just to bring the story to a conclusion, what happens is they come down, they live in an area called Goshen in Egypt. But 17 years after all of this happens, Jacob dies. And it's interesting. Joseph expresses all this grace and mercy, all this grace and mercy. And everything's going fine, right? 17 years. Then the father dies. And the brothers are still thinking, perhaps now that dad's dead, Joe's going to come and get us. Isn't that incredible? See, they knew the depth of injury they perpetrated against their brothers. And they're thinking, what would I do if I was in his place? Well, what I would do as soon as dad's dead, let's go. Now I'm going to get you. Joseph replied, don't be afraid for me, or don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I should punish you? He couldn't believe. He was incredulous. I can't believe you think now that dad's dead, I'm going to make you pay for what you did. And so he says the 3 most famous words from Joseph's mouth. Am I God that I can punish you? No, I'm not. You intended harm to me. That is true. But God intended it for good. That is more true. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I'll continue to take care of you and your children. Then it just wraps up his life. Joseph lived 110, then he died. Okay. So what truth does Joseph's life reveal to us? Well, lots of truth. Principle among those things would be this: what you conclude about God determines the decisions you make. I said that earlier, right? How you view God will propel your decisions. Is he faithful? That's going to influence how you treat other people when you're hurt, because I believe in a greater reality. Yes, I'm hurt, but the greater reality is my God is faithful and he's good. Where else does the willingness to forgive come from? It's born out of a proper concept of God. That he loves me, even though people don't always care to. We all have a lower story. You know what the lower story is? The lower story is simply the events and circumstances of life on earth, which includes the people that have hurt us, betrayed us, hated us, mistreated us, taken from us, stolen from us. The lower story includes all those painful events. And what happens is we're living it, we're experiencing it, so we really do live in it, and we respond each time to those injuries. That's the lower story. But there's an upper story, and the upper story is the other half of the equation, which is greater. And the upper story is that God is good and he's working in our lower stories. And the calling that we have as his children, just like Joseph, is to see our lower story events through the lens of an upper story God. But if you get lost in the events of the lower story, you will not see what God is doing, upper story. You'll miss the grace. You'll miss his sovereignty. You'll miss the blessing because you're so fixated on lower story events. Are we together? This is what we learn from Joseph. Don't get lost in this. Are you in denial? No, these things all happened to him. And he said, I've been wrongly accused. I've been thrown in prison. He admitted his pain. He just didn't live in it. Because the greater reality is my God is doing something. So, his upper story statements, what are they? Am I in God's place? You meant him for evil, but God meant it for good. Don't be worried. Don't be afraid. I'll care for you and your children. Those are upper story comments, living in the lower story of pain. So I'd just like you, as we kind of draw this to a close, bring to mind, as I'm talking, anyone who you suspect or you know you haven't yet forgiven. And just hold on to that name or those names for a minute. Because I like to, we could spend lots of time on what forgiveness is and isn't, but let me just share a couple of things. Joseph knew how to forgive. And this is what is true about forgiveness. Forgiveness fundamentally, it's a decision. And we can go to that next slide. Forgiveness is a decision, it's not a feeling. Feelings are involved, but that's not the propulsion, if you will, of the forgiving. The forgiving it's a decision. If I wait until I feel like it, I'm never going to get there. So it's volitional. So it's choosing. It's choosing to extend mercy in the face of an injustice. In face of a moral wrong leveled against you, forgiveness is choosing to extend mercy. Forgiveness is choosing not to harbor resentment or to seek revenge. Forgiveness is choosing to extend generosity and love to the very one or ones who've injured you. Generosity and love. It's not just the absence of vengeance, it's the presence of generosity and love, right? Because sometimes they go, well, yeah, I'm going to forgive. I'll just never think about that person again. They're not going to get my wrath. They should be happy they're not getting it. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is not just avoiding wrath and anger toward them. It's heaping upon them generosity and love. Forgiveness, my friends, is the only path which leads to your healing. You see, we think that if I can just get justice here, if fairness can just come around the horn, come around the corner, and come back to me, then everything will be okay. Because now I've been treated fairly in the face of being what? Treated unfairly. And so I'll be healed. Everything will be put to the rights when now I'm treated fair again. And that's what we wait for. That person to change their approach toward me. That person to come to me and ask forgiveness. Oh, then I'll be healed. No, you won't. You will not be healed. You'll be stuck. You'll be stuck in your wounds and you'll become a bitter, resentful person. What I'm saying to you is true of me as well. What is it that actually brings healing? Forgiveness. The very thing you think you don't want to give because it'll cost you too much is the very thing that's going to heal your heart. Fairness won't heal you. Forgiving another will. And forgiveness is the releasing of God's grace into your life. And that's where the healing comes. You flip a switch that dispenses the grace when you choose to forgive. And the grace lands on you. Albert Haas says, it takes a lot of emotional and psychological energy to keep a grudge alive. The longer I allow a wound to fester, the more bitterness, anger, and self-pity poison my blood, and listen to this, eat away at my heart. Refusing to forgive is the most dangerous thing you can perpetrate against yourself. And that's what you're doing. That's what I would be doing. A couple more things. Forgiveness is not forgetting. I'd love to unpack this more, but just understand, forgiveness has nothing to do with forgetting. Whatever happened to you happened. It's a part of history. It's an event or a series of events. And I don't know who came up with this. You haven't forgiven until you've forgotten. It's garbage. It's not true. The truth is the beauty of forgiveness. Think about Jesus. Has he forgotten what we've done? And this is really where it comes from. One of the Psalms says that He's removed our sins from us as far as the east is from the west, and it has, right? And he remembers them no more. It's a poor translation into English because it doesn't mean, and he forgets them altogether. What it means is he refuses to drudge up what he knows we've done and shove it into our face and say, hey, remember when you did this? That's what it means to remember no more. But somehow we translate that to think that, hey, if I haven't forgotten what they did to me, then I'm really not at the point of forgiveness yet. That's not true. How do you unremember? Besides, if that was true of God, if that verse was true, it means that he remembers it no more. Jesus is scratching his head that I said, what was the whole thing about the cross? Why do I have holes in my hands? Why did I do that? I don't remember. The beauty of forgiveness is that Jesus does remember what we did that took him to the cross, and he went anyway. That's the beauty of it. He just won't shove it back in our face again. And so forgiveness isn't somehow forgetting. It's not amnesia. It's not condoning. It's not condemning. Sometimes we forgive and we have this sort of attitude of superiority. No, forgiveness isn't condemning. They don't need to hear from you how much they wounded you. They don't need to hear that. Tell God that, but they don't need to hear it. Forgive them. You don't need to condemn them. Two other things. Forgiveness is not fairness. It's not. It's not about fairness. It's about grace. We're admitting that the tables are imbalanced. Something unfair did happen. Something unjust or unjust did happen. Forgiveness doesn't all of a sudden make things fair again. Forgiveness is dispensing grace and mercy because of the lack of fairness, because of the injustice. And the last thing is, forgiveness is not reconciliation. It is not. And sometimes people think, I can't really forgive unless they come to me and they apologize. We sort of hug it out. Now we forgive it. No, forgiveness takes one person. Reconciliation takes two. You can forgive someone, they may have no clue they've hurt you. You can forgive someone and they may still feel an animosity toward you. You can forgive them. You don't need them to know anything or do anything for you to forgive them. Forgiveness is a one-man show, you and God toward another. Reconciliation is the repairing, the mutual decision to repair a relationship. Okay, I want to say one more thing to drive this home, all right? When Jesus Christ died on the cross, was that forgiveness or reconciliation? It was forgiveness. It was the act of Jesus for us. And then when does the reconciliation come? When any one of us decides, when he died and offered forgiveness, I'm the one that needed it. And so we approach the cross where Christ gave forgiveness, a unilateral act, and then reconciliation happens when we say, I need that forgiveness, right? So he died once for all, but not all will have reconciliation because not all will go to Jesus and say, I need forgiveness. It's the same thing in our relationships. You forgive, and then you just pray someday for reconciliation because that takes two. All right. I know there's a lot here. Friends, just dare to forgive. Just dare to forgive. The band's going to come out right now, and I just encourage you, bow your heads for a moment. We're going to sing, but I want you to reflect just for a moment. Listen closely. If you don't mind, just close your eyes if you're comfortable doing that. Listen closely. You are never more like Jesus Christ than when you choose to forgive. And you will never become like him unless you do. Take a moment, focus on those that maybe you've been wrestling to forgive. I spent some difficult time preparing this message, thinking about those that I've withheld forgiveness from. Maybe that's reflective of you, maybe it's not.